Hi, I'm Jenny Bressler with Central Bank. I'm the training director for Central Bank and have been for 3 years. I also am on the Utah Bankers Association Education Committee. I'm really excited to introduce Neelam Chand, who is going to be talking with us and really educating us on DE&I. So if you're not sure what DE&I is, diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're going to get really comfortable with those terms. And I'm really excited. We started planning this podcast clear back in January, and it was really good timing that we're able to do this podcast right now. So Neelam Chand is an accomplished diversity, equity, and inclusion expert with a decade of experience of embedding multiculturalism into a business strategy and facilitating critical dialogue on systemic change within a workplace environment. She currently works at Zions Bank as an SVP, Diversity and Inclusion Officer, where she provides workshops on topics that include social justice, tokenism, microaggressions, implicit bias, intersectionality, and women of color in the workplace. When it comes to inclusion work, her philosophy is to keep it real and to keep the etiquette of making people feel comfortable. She believes that people must feel uncomfortable to begin the process of empathy and inspire positive change. Wow, that is very true, Neelam. You believe that people must feel uncomfortable to begin the process of empathy and inspire positive change. I'm right there. So I'm really excited to talk with you today about this topic and what's going on in the current environment. Tell me, what are your thoughts about what's going on right now?
Thank you for providing a platform for us to have this conversation, for everybody to listen to. Very timely and very relevant. It's been chaotic. I have to say, and just a quick disclaimer, I have been on maternity leave and I'm coming back with a newborn, and working from home has been very interesting because we're sharing spaces, and so you will probably hear the baby in the background, maybe crying or making noises. So that's happening. But that's just how it is these days. Everybody's their authentic self as they're trying to balance their home and work life. But among all of this, the backdrop of COVID and this pandemic, we have been having conversations about race. And we have been seeing that our Black community are being systemically impacted by race. And it's not just today and it's not just last week, but it's been over 400 years worth of systemic racism. And so it's important that we're having these conversations, but it's also important to recognize that these conversations have been happening for a long time. And for those who are sort of new to the conversation, I'm glad you're here and you're doing it. But there's a lot to catch up on. And in my practice as a diversity and inclusion officer, it's been interesting because this work has sort of been amplified with the national conversation. A lot of organizations are wanting to really engage in a conversation of diversity and inclusion. And a lot of organizations are looking at their practices and asking themselves a question: how are we fostering anti-racist a workplace environment? How are we fostering inclusion? How are we really truly making sure that our employees belong? And my question back to everybody is, while you're having this conversation right now, why right now? Why didn't you have this conversation months ago, years ago? Why now? And once organizations start asking themselves that question, then they're really able to get at the heart of their intentions. And I think that's just important. I think just being authentic, if it's because you feel the pressure to have the conversation because everybody's having it, say it, admit to it, own it. If it's because you feel that, that this is very important to your employees, own that and make that be known. it's important to recognize why we're having this conversation now and why we didn't have that conversation before. So kind of what I've been questioning a lot of organizations with, and specifically financial organizations that are having this conversation.
That's great. I'm really glad that you're here with us. Can you go into a little bit about the differences between diversity, equity, and isolation?
Yeah, so I want to actually read off what we have on our Zions Bank website. I actually wrote it, so I'm just going to read it, and I think it really just brings it together. For those of you who want to actually see it in words, you can go onto the Zions Bank website and under diversity. But the difference between, and I'm actually going to do the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then we'll talk a little bit about isolation. So the way we define diversity is a variety of collective thoughts, perspectives, experiences, ideas, and backgrounds, which are typically rooted in one's identity. This includes gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, age, ability, veteran status, citizenship status, and any of these intersecting identities. And what I mean when I say intersecting is that everyone has a multitude of and layers of identities. You're not just a woman. Some women are women of color. Some are women with a disability. Some are, males who have a military background. And then the age variation is also part of that. So it's not just single identities that are being served and considered as diverse. Another way to think about diversity is that it's quantifiable, and it's typically referred to representation. There's really not much to it. When you're talking about diversity, you're talking about people, and you're talking about representation. Now, equity, on the other hand, is to create access and opportunities for all employees. It's to acknowledge that there's a cultural, social, and environmental barrier in the workplace that can directly impact an employee's experience and success within a workplace. The key word to equity is access. And so you have diversity as representation, you have equity as access. There's this illustration out there that I love that I use a lot in my training. I'm going to try to paint the picture for you all, for you listening. But there's two pictures side by side of a soccer stadium. And on the left side of the picture is the soccer stadium, there's a game, and there's three people in front of the fence. And one person can actually see over the fence and see the game. The other person in the middle is a little bit shorter and can't necessarily see over the game. And then the other person is in a wheelchair. That is how you describe equality. Equality is everybody has access to watch the game, but not everybody has the access to enjoy the game. On the other side of the photo is equity. And it illustrates the same picture, but you have the person who can see over the fence, can just see over the fence, but the person who's short that couldn't see over the fence has now like a stool or a block to stand on so they can see over the fence. And the person with a wheelchair has a ramp so that they can see it. So equity is really trying to understand each individual's needs and access, and then making sure that you are creating more opportunity for that person to engage, to have equal access. So there are two different things that really is distinct. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, that's helpful. That helps a lot.
And then inclusion. The way we describe inclusion is that every employee feels like they belong. When you foster inclusion, you are searching for an environment that's safe for all identities to be fully engaged. This means that when someone walks into the door, they immediately know that they can be their full selves. They don't have to filter any part of who they are, and that there is no fear of judgment based off of who they are. That is true inclusion. So when you don't feel equity and you don't feel inclusion, then you definitely get a sense of isolation. You become the only, or you're stereotyped, or there are these biases against you that keep you from really engaging and keep you from feeling like you're part of something. So that's sort of the difference between those three pieces that everybody kind of puts together as DEI is all one thing. They're very different from one another.
They sure are. That is really helpful. I appreciate you really defining all three of those so that we can know now go forward and really know what, as you refer to those, what you're really talking about. What are some common things that come up in a workplace setting that you have seen isolate people?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we're in a time where now we've sort of switched from, seeing people face to face to communicating virtually. And we see some of those types of interactions that maybe lead to isolation transfer into a remote working space. Things that come up commonly in a workplace setting is microaggressions. And what that is there are subtle and often automatic exchanges that happen either in daily conversations or in action that put people down. And sometimes they're not intentional. Sometimes they're sort of these unconscious biases that creep up, but they're these day-to-day subtle interactions that really can isolate someone. We're thinking about the word isolation. So originally, microaggressions was coined as racial microaggressions, but then kind of sort of expanded to cover all identities because all marginalized identities were also feeling microaggressions. So an example of microaggressions, something that I have gotten my whole life, as a woman of color living in Utah, is I've had people ask me, where are you from? Sounds like an innocuous question, right? There's nothing crazy about it. And I typically say, well, I was born in California. And then that person will proceed to say, no, where are you really from? And then I will, and I kind of know what they're getting at, but instead I just kind of say, well, I was, brought up in Davis County, Utah. And they're like, no, where are you really, really, really from? And again, not such an insulting question if I didn't get that every single day. And so the microaggression there is that the impact of that is saying that you don't look like you're from here. You don't look like you're American because of the color of your skin. You must be from this country, or you just don't belong here. And that's not what they're saying. They're not saying that right off the bat. But the hidden message behind where are you from is that you don't look like you belong here. And after hearing that, a microaggression doesn't happen just once. It happens. It's a constant occurrence. And they really happen on a day-to-day basis, several times a day, and can really compound someone's experience. And so when you're getting that every day, where are you from? Where are you really from? After a while, it can get annoying, but it could also be internalized. Like, I don't really belong here. All of a sudden, I'm feeling insecure about my own identity. And so that's an example of sort of a racial microaggression that's pretty common. But another example is, gender is a gender microaggression, gender-based microaggression. And one thing that's been coming up that I know a lot of women in the workplace have either dealt with is, being asked to take notes in a meeting. Automatically, women in a space, if that's not their job, if they don't have an administrative role in their job description, they still are asked to take notes or bring coffee or order lunch or coordinate a meeting or coordinate some sort of party of some sort or gathering. And that in and of its own is a microaggression. It's just kind of playing on these gender stereotypes that women roles are supposed to be administrative, not leadership. And so that's sort of the microaggression that happens within a workplace in terms of gender. And now we see that play out in the virtual world, where women are having a hard time voicing their opinion or having a voice at the table when that was already hard to do physically in a space, at a working space, to not get interrupted online in a Zoom call. The other microaggression that comes up quite a bit virtually is generational microaggression. When it's assumed that people who are older cannot use technology. And there are a lot of jokes about that can really make people feel like they don't belong, that they don't, they're not useful. And that can really impact a person's well-being, really.
Right. I can see that it's just about us being more aware of what we're saying and what we're thinking. Now, going back to where you started, what would be a better question for someone to say to you instead of saying, where are you from? No, really, where are you from? What would be a better way to go about that? Because I know that in the last couple of weeks, as I have really contemplated things that I say or have said, and what are ways to say them better? Because I think sometimes people don't speak up because they're afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing, and they certainly don't intend to hurt anyone.
I prefer people asking me what my ethnic background is. What's your ethnicity? What's your ethnic background? I think that's a proper way. If you're really trying to understand what my race is or what my ethnicity is, then you can just ask what your ethnicity is. But to say, where are you from? Again, that inadvertently says you're not from here. When you ask, what's your ethnic background? That's just a straightforward question. So there's not a subliminal message behind it or a hidden message behind it. It is what it is. But I think you bring up an interesting conversation too around fear of saying the wrong things, because now we have all these terminologies to express types of discrimination and feelings of discrimination. And so when you have that terminology, you have language around it, and that could turn a lot of people off because, well, they're afraid to have these conversations because maybe they're perpetuating a microaggression, or maybe they're perpetuating a stereotype. And what I say to that is that the fear is real, I get it, but being uncomfortable is probably the most important thing that anybody can do in the learning process. I say it in Jenny, you were kind of read it in my bio and my description of me, but my job is to make people feel uncomfortable. My job is to have these uncomfortable conversations. And if people are not feeling uncomfortable, then they're not really learning. And so if you feel like I'm worried and afraid to say the wrong thing, just say it and be comfortable with the fact that you're probably are going to be confronted with what you said. But I say that in caution, right? You don't want to just go out and just offend people. Think twice about what you say, but also you're never going to really learn if you don't say or anything or stop. So if you speak up and not be afraid, but maybe understand that being uncomfortable is what is needed for you to learn, then it won't be as scary.
Okay. Great advice. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Right. Right. And then with microaggressions, there's a lot of resources out there, but language matters. The things that we say matters. The way we ask questions matters. So just really thinking about what you're saying and why you're saying it. If you're a male colleague and you're asking a female colleague to take notes, think about why you're asking that question. And or if you're making a joke, or if you hear a joke that's inappropriate or that can make someone feel uncomfortable, or back to the word isolation, isolated, then it's important that you call it out. It's important that you say something rather than just let it happen. So there's the feeling uncomfortable and being okay with feeling uncomfortable, but also being okay with speaking out and being uncomfortable in that space as well.
Yes, great advice. As we have this conversation and knowing that our audience are in the financial industry and that we live in Utah, how do you see the best way for us to move forward and start having these conversations and be more aggressive, aware, and educated about how we handle this in the workplace so that it doesn't continue, so that we can move forward in a positive way?
Exception that it's majority white males and white male dominated, which is frankly true if you look at statistics and data. But you have to think about our history and who had access to wealth from the very beginning, and how that has played out today. So people of color, women, marginalized identities didn't always have access to health. And even you can go back to our history between, Black identities and white identities who had access to wealth. And so today, because predominantly white males have had access to wealth from the very beginning and we're very privileged, that hasn't necessarily, it's changed, but that same sort of trend has kind of played out to today. And in order for us to sort of disrupt that trend, we need to really take a look at how financial companies and businesses are doing business, what their policies look like. Are these policies still leaving people out? When you're thinking about diversity and inclusion, are you thinking about those barriers that had originally left people of color out, had originally left women out, had originally left LGBTQ communities and identities out? Are you thinking about, when you're hiring and recruiting, are you thinking about expanding the network of people that you serve? Or are you just hiring people that look exactly like you? So there's a pattern here that we need to disrupt, especially in the financial industry. And I think these are the types of questions we need to be asking. What does our policy look like? Are we just being comfortable and making sure people who look like us are in the boardrooms? What does our leadership makeup look like? Why don't we have more women? Why don't we have more people of color? I think those are the types of questions we need to start asking. We need to disrupt that pattern. And I think it's happening. I think it's happening a little bit slowly, though, with the financial industry. And I think we can speed it up a bit, and I think we need to really, really just challenge our leaders who are leading the financial industry to really think about diversity and inclusion, to really think about representation.
I like that. I like that a lot. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, it's important that because I'm Caucasian, but I'm a woman, or I should say, and I'm a woman. And so I have experienced some microaggressions. And when I lived in Southern California, I definitely was the minority. And that was a good experience for me to be able to have that and have my eyes opened to what that felt like to be the minority. I like what you say about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, to be the one to have the courage to open your mouth and learn how to ask the question in a more thoughtful way, as well as, if you are the minority, to be able to maybe just say it flat out, like, are you wondering what my ethnicity is? I like that. And I wish I would have had some of this dialogue thought through in my mind when I lived in Southern California. I think that I would have been able to feel more empowered to be able to reach out to people instead of kind of waiting for them to come to me. So I am so happy that we're having this conversation, and I'm so grateful that you have so much knowledge about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. I'd like to talk a little bit about specifically how we can have these conversations. And I'm a big one on tools. Like, if you tell me something, you give me some advice, or you give me some knowledge, some of your knowledge, I want to have a tool to go along with it so that I know how to really implement it and use it, and not just walk away feeling motivated and good for 15 minutes and then my life goes on to the next, I need to, whatever else I'm going to do, that evening. And then I forget about this conversation. Like, if we have a tool to be able to help us really implement this into our lives, I think that will be helpful to really make a change. So what kind of specific conversations can we have? How do we start these conversations? Do we have these conversations maybe in an office meeting or in a board meeting, or something like that? As I was doing some research, and as I've been trying to learn myself, I read an article about a program that helps organizations create cultural shifts by guiding them to engage in conversations specifically about race and ethnicity, to help us build trust with each other. the conversations, they said, started specifically with, going around a circle saying, when I grew up, or let me explain to you where I'm coming from, or let me explain what race means to me and my experiences with racism and how I have been advantaged or disadvantaged, and really allow everybody in the group to have a minute to explain themselves, so that it's kind of, I think that is a good way to start that trust foundation.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jenny. The most important thing that anybody can do is share their story, and just through storytelling, connecting with people. That actually gets rid of a lot of fear as well. When you're listening to people's stories, you're also thinking about your own stories, and you're finding ways to connect with somebody rather than just automatically getting into a defense. So storytelling is really, really important. I also think that storytelling, when it's the right time, is also very important. So making sure to amplify the voices that don't have the opportunity to tell their stories, and making sure that becomes a priority. So when you're having this company dialogue, really trying to understand the stories of marginalized voices, and listening to those stories. The other thing I think, with storytelling, is really listening with empathy and connecting with people in a way that's a little bit more deeper. It's a deeper type of listening. It's not feeling sorry for somebody. It's not showing sort of this idea of sympathy, but it's really kind of digging deep and finding some common ground to connect with. So when you're talking to somebody who's different from you, whose experiences are different from you, it's important to dig deep within yourself and find ways to connect with that person based off of your own experiences. So for instance, when you're talking to someone who's different from you and they're talking about their experiences of being excluded, or experiencing racism, think back to yourself, a time where you felt excluded. You may never be able to actually feel what they're feeling. You may never understand fully what that person's going through, but somehow you'll ignite something within yourself to say, I can understand that to some extent. I can actually support you in these ways. I think that's just human connection, just kind of getting back to the basics of human nature, really leading with empathy in conversations. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I encourage people to do. These tough conversations, people shy away from because they're worried that they're going to say the wrong thing, or they're worried that they're going to cause more harm, or there's people who just don't want to be in that space. But think about your own human instinct of empathy, dig deep into that, and have that conversation. It'll be, I won't say it would be easier, and I won't say that you're going to feel completely comfortable, right? But it will open it up where there's a two-way dialogue, where it's not just this one-way dialogue where you're feeling defensive, or you're feeling attacked, or whatever that may be. But really just leading with empathy is a good way to start engaging in these conversations in the workplace, and understanding that we're humans, that although we are all working in a financial industry and we're doing our day-to-day, we're actually human. Yeah. And we're, each one of us are going through, we're dealing with this pandemic right now. We're dealing with balancing things from, at home. We're human. And so there's some compassion there. There's some empathy there that I think we can all connect on, but also to recognize that other experiences there are other identities out there that are feeling this a little bit more, that are challenged with a little bit more. And for us to actually lean in with our empathetic ear, we'll be able to understand that and have a fruitful conversation.
Okay, that's great.
Sorry, the other thing I wanted to mention, I kind of went off rambling, but the other thing is educating yourself before you have these conversations, so that you can feel comfortable and better equipped to have these conversations. So, Jenny, you mentioned, you were reading this article. There's so many blogs and articles written out there on the internet about diversity and inclusion, and just even how to engage in a conversation. But I think that educating yourself and being self-aware is probably the best thing to do first, before you start to engage other other folks, because it all kind of happens it starts really with you as an individual.
Right. Right. Great advice. And I have had that experience, especially in the last 2 weeks, and it has been very eye-opening. And so I appreciate that. Do you have any specific books or websites that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I've got a few books. So Biased is the title. Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do by Jennifer Eberhardt. Fairly new. I think it came out last year. And then the other one, if you want to have a conversation about, we didn't really get into this, but if you want to have a conversation about privilege and understanding racial inequities, White Fragility is a great book by Robin DiAngelo. It really kind of gets into our history, but it also talks a little bit about how to engage in conversations around race. If you are a white person who's wanting to either lead or be a part of a conversation about race. The other thing, another privilege, this you can find it online, it's a PDF, but a read on privilege is Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. And she really gets at the heart of what privilege means. And there's a little activity in there in the PDF that you'll find online that you can do to kind of identify your own privileges, things that you didn't even know you were privileged in. So it's a really eye-opening read. And then just one about gender, which I really love because it talks about gender and sexual orientation. It's called A Guide to Gender by Sam Killerman. And the book really goes through different terminology when it comes to gender and sexual orientation. And then it talks about the intersection. We were talking about intersectional identity. So it talks about when a person has several different identities in terms of gender and sexual orientation and kind of gets into that. So really great read. And these are great books to bring into a workspace to have your coworkers read with you and have conversations about. To do it by yourself is good, but to do it with others is even better. Yeah. So these are great tools to have to bring into the workplace to start the conversation. I feel like when they've never had this conversation before, the first conversation or the first interaction or the first sort of initial exposure to diversity and inclusion can be very off-putting.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to be the case. But at the same time, if it's off-putting, then I feel like people should ask themselves, why is it off-putting? Why am I feeling this way?
Yeah. Well, I think the reason that they're feeling that way, because I am that person, is because I have not had many opportunities to have this conversation. And it's not that I didn't want to. It's not that I was shying away from it. I simply don't. It just doesn't come up in my world very much. I'm very sheltered, and I'm realizing how sheltered I am. And so that's just really honest, And so, but I have a friend who has a daughter who is half Black and she's white. So this daughter of hers grew up in Utah and she looks more Black than white. And I've been able to read her posts that she's been writing. And I've worked with her in our church group. And she's just an amazing young woman. And I had no idea what she was experiencing, what her reality was. And so this has been good for many reasons, but for me to be able to say this is a conversation that probably should have come up a long time ago. And maybe I could have bonded with her more and enriched our relationship more if I would have felt comfortable asking the questions.
Right. Well, I think that's the key thing about storytelling too. I feel like if you're not asking the questions, then you're not establishing the trust. Therefore, you're not hearing the stories that you want to hear to get close to somebody, to actually engage in an empathetic conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I think, and one thing I wanted to mention too is that, in storytelling, there's a level of vulnerability that both parties have to be in. You have to sort of get to the core of who you are. So kind of going back to, just being human, but really going in a space of vulnerability and saying, I'm going to be who I am right now. I'm going to let my ego and I'm going to let my pride go. I'm going to let the fear of being judged go. And I'm just going to be vulnerable in this space, in this moment, so I can have an authentic conversation with somebody and understand their story, and they can understand my story, and we can connect in that way. And then from there, we can start thinking about actions to take. It can coexist. And it's not so, there's not a lot, and it sounds beautiful, right? It sounds like a beautiful thing to do. It's really hard to accomplish because we are all stuck in our own pride and ego. Mm-hmm. And this work is about dismantling your pride and ego. This work is, there's not a checkbox on like step 1, you got to do this, and step 2, you got to do this. Sure, there's a lot of resources, but the first thing is you need to dismantle your own pride, ego. You got to understand your privilege. You got to understand our history, and in order to have these conversations. And then at the end of the day, you got to be vulnerable you have to be willing and vulnerable to have these conversations.
All right, Neelam, I sure appreciate the opportunity to be able to have this conversation with you today. I have learned so much, and I think that my main takeaway from today, as I was kind of taking notes during our conversation, is empathy. For me, is being able to really get to that level of finding that common ground that I have with people that I talk to and think about. And so I really appreciate all of the information that you've given us today, and appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And again, thank you for starting the conversation. I hope that the conversation continues with all of you who are listening. I hope you take what you've heard, critique it, have conversations with your team, talk to your leadership folks, ask important questions, and really be that change agent within your organization.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of you who have listened in today. Go forward with courage and get used to feeling uncomfortable. The more times you feel uncomfortable, the more times you're going to realize that it can end up being something really beautiful. So have a great day. Thank you.